Stan Lee's life is a great lesson in making sure you have the T's crossed and the I's dotted about your estate and your affairs, because people come in and take advantage of them, and they may even be helping them in certain ways. Every vulture has a rationalization and stuff you can look and go, that's a good thing they did. Like I said, especially once his wife was dead, she had been a very vigorous defender of his and their interests.
Life's Third Act is a podcast dedicated to helping you get the most out of your retirement. Sponsored by Tucker Allen. Here's attorney CPA Joe Cordell.
Okay, today we're picking up with episode 2 of our 3-episode coverage of Stan Lee, his life, his estate planning, the decisions relating to the estate planning. So we're going to be doing that in a total of 3 parts. So there'll be one part after this, as I explained at the conclusion of the last part. So hopefully you'll stay not only for this, which is the balance of Stan's life, but hopefully you'll also tune in for our 3rd episode, which will focus on those things that I think many of you are interested in when you come to this station. So if you want to just watch the 3rd episode, you can skip this one, but I hope that you sit in with this. I found it fascinating, and I hope you will too. So Stan, and I've read that it was Stan everywhere, meaning Stan's name would be on letters, and these published letters that you describe would bear Stan, and then everything else that the public saw. I'm glad you corrected that, because really what you described happened was the antithesis of what I had thought. But it's interesting that what ended up being the best product was one that was loosened rather than one that was, had this regimented. So let me ask you, so what if somebody comes up with the plot, though, in this scenario, the Marvel method? So somebody surely comes up with a plot that is binding on the person doing the drawing and ultimately the dialogue. Is that not true, or did the plot evolve with
that's where Stan, serving as both the editor and art director and writer, came in. And that's where some of the ill will came in, because maybe he'd have a 5-minute discussion with Jack Kirby or Steve Ditko, and they'd come in with the story, and Stan would say, no, that doesn't work. That art doesn't work. You need to redo it. And a lot of the time, those guys wouldn't get paid anymore for that. So they did, so there was a lot of resentment and anger. But I mean, it's funny. These are very complicated relationships. And sometimes if you read things that these guys say in later years, it almost sounds like, like a broken love affair or something. It just sounds like these, they knew there was something special going on. They could just tell by the mail and just they because the thing is, none of them, neither Kirby nor Ditko nor Lee, I think, ever did. They all worked a lot. They all did a lot of stuff, interesting, but nothing that ever really captured an audience to that degree. I think you can't leave Martin Goodman out of it either. I think, as time goes on, I think Goodman, he was Stan's relative, but he was Stan's boss, and he was not without very smart commercial sensibilities himself, to survive in the pulp business and the comics business for 40 years before he sold Marvel.
And clearly you're right that this happened big and over a short period of time, that they had to realize that they were participating in something historic. One thing that indicates that is this Esquire poll of college students. I mean, to go from 1960, we can safely say it was just kids under, say, 8 or 9 years old that were reading these things, and then go to 65 and a poll that of college students that puts in the top 28 heroes, the people they looked up to in America, among which were Dylan and John F. Kennedy, but Spider-Man and Hulk. So, I mean, to come that far, and these are college kids. I mean, to come that far that fast, that's what, 4 years from the I guess, were initially printed in 61?
I guess what Stan did is not something you can quantify. Because, I mean, in later years, what Marvel became known for doing things in that Marvel method, but really with that, because I wrote a lot of stories for them and edited a lot, and that would really mean you would write a detailed plot synopsis and then put the dialogue in later. But that was much more formal than what Stan and Jack and Steve were doing.
So it was more free form during this early period. And that kind of makes sense when you think about Hollywood, and I guess there are some good parallels where you have somebody doing, the visual, somebody's in charge, of course, with the screenplay, et cetera, and then they have to cooperate. I guess you all have a miniature version when you do that in your industry.
Exactly.
With what happens on a bigger scale with more money in LA. So let me go to the subject, which fascinates me, that here these guys knew at the time that they were creating characters. They knew by 65 that they were creating characters that likely would have very profitable lives in some form. And I would argue they could even have anticipated at least TV, maybe not movies, but TV. As we saw, soon Batman appeared. I don't know what year in the 60s. So why would they not, or if they did, why did it not succeed for them to demand some intellectual property claims?
There is an interesting shell game that goes on in popular culture, and it's not limited to Marvel. People created characters. Let's say Spider-Man, but there's a million others, right? Some combination of Stan Lee and Steve Ditko, but then Spider-Man becomes an entity and almost a person of his own. So that once these guys established the characters and the characteristics and the powers and the world, then other people, other very talented people, can take it over who have no claim in the creation of the character. And so it's almost as if, there were just so many things in the world, like who created toothpaste? I don't know. You know?
But still, it raises the question, though. But you're right, and that happens to characters and products, as you point out. But still, someone is paid for that initial character. However, it's changed up. If it bears the name and likeness, then of course, in this case, Marvel gets paid for the use of any of those characters. I just wonder why these guys. I mean, you yourself can easily envision sitting in their chair. So I'm kind of asking you, if you were sitting in your role in '65, would the thought not have crossed your mind that maybe I can demand from my employer that they allow me, to have some intellectual.
I think we're looking at it from a 2024 perspective. The kind of original sin of comics is what happened to Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, the creators of Superman. They created Superman. They sold him for $130, as the legend goes. And if you look at the check, somebody found the original check, and there was like 5 other stories they did that month that's on that check. But Superman, $130. All rights. Although it wasn't that clearly defined then, but they were doing very well for the times. They were paid well by DC Comics, but it was clear that they did not own that property they created. And when they did try to get more, they had some bad legal advice. But even if they didn't, when they did try to get more, they were basically let go by DC and ended up by the 70s in very dire financial straits. And then eventually, I think after their heirs of a couple of generations initiated lawsuits, I think the heirs have now finally gotten some small percentage of the value of Superman. So that example certainly existed. But I think if you look at it from a 2024 perspective with these blockbuster movies, then of course they would be idiots not to have engaged the top lawyers and fought tooth and nail. But I think the comics business was considered so second class. And I think what we were talking about before the pause was that you sign a deal or you just make a verbal deal where the company owns these characters, and then the characters take on an existence of their own without you. And so the company just hires other people to do those characters. Why didn't those guys initiate? A lot of them were either immigrants or the children of immigrants.
Stan was very ambitious, though. He was burning with ambition. But I get it, what you're saying. I guess he could not foresee perhaps the level of success. And maybe more importantly, he simply knew he didn't have the negotiating power because he'd have to negotiate that ahead of the creation of future characters. And it may have been that Goodman would say, look, if you're going to insist on this, go work somewhere else.
The difference would happen with the Superman versus Batman, and again, this is getting into the details. The creator of Batman, Bob Kane, who was actually the co-creator, but there was a guy named Bill Finger. A lot of this comes from the tradition of newspaper comics, where there's one name, even if it's a studio full of a dozen people drawing and writing. Kane, I think, was a little more savvy politically and socially, and got a better deal, although certainly not, nowhere near the worth of Batman. The companies would often do is usually it would be two guys would create a character, so they'd give one a few bucks and sort of set him against the other. I mean, it's not that it didn't happen. I just think the precedent was set early that they didn't, because I think that whole what you refer to the work for hire, where you do something but the company owns it. I think in the 30s, I think in the 20s and 30s and even the 40s, that law was still being developed and settled. And in future years, there were people who sued, and the companies also in recent years have started being willing to share somewhat of the profits, but it's still very crude, and even the contracts people have are kind of vague. And I was just at a comic convention last week where, even people who are very successful and well-known comic artists and writers still, need to bring in lawyers to enforce their rights by copyright law. So I just think, I think there wasn't that big worldview from a lot of people.
Yeah.
And they don't want to rock the boat. Obviously, if you sue somebody, not only will they not hire you, but then the word gets around in this very small, incestuous comic book business that nobody else wants a troublemaker either. So, I think that kind of thing comes into play. I think Stan saw himself as management, and although he didn't own it, I think because it was his relative, he identified with it.
And I think at the end of the day, if it wasn't done in the industry and he were to demand it and stand his ground, and you have to do this before you've actually created it, because after you've created it, you obviously have no contractual rights. But I mean, beforehand, if he had tried to negotiate that contract with his employer, I think that you and I agree he'd be unemployed.
It was a Captain America serial in the 1940s. And I think Goodman might have even given the rights away. I think I think in those days, they saw any other media adaptation as promotion for the comic books, which is where at that point, their money was. 10, 20 years later, it was the other way around. Hollywood would be where the money was, and the comics were small potatoes.
And then, of course, by the time it was clear that there was big money in the intellectual property, then he didn't have the ability to demand it. Furthermore, a lot of these characters had already been created, so that's history. Once you've created under the old regime where you've had a contract of an employee, then those rights wouldn't exist. So I can see how it got out from under him. I'm sure in later years, he with the advantage of hindsight, he would have negotiated, he would like to have had a different arrangement. But it turns out, though, that he did, in fact, develop a contract somewhere along the way with the owners, and I don't know who the owners were at the time, maybe it's Goodman, in which he was to get 10% of the profit attributable to his characters from broadcast and movies. And I think he won a lawsuit over that very issue in the early 2000s. Is that right?
He won a lawsuit, but Marvel had gone into bankruptcy. There was a clause, I think, that was signed before the movies or TV were very big. So it was like, well, big, And I mean, I think those properties were considered dead, or certainly not highly profitable. There'd been the Hulk TV show and the Spider-Man TV show, but that was some cartoons. They did okay. So Stan, did ultimately sue them, and they settled for a reporter, because this is all under NDA, so nobody knows for sure. But supposedly they paid him a flat $10 million.
That was what I read, yeah.
And then I guess, again, I think he probably had some ownership in stock. But I think it is important to mention that he did not own any more of those characters than you or I do.
Yeah.
Yeah. He never claimed he did, but he had a lot of trouble. When Marvel went into Chapter 11, he signed a contract where he would devote 10% of his time to Marvel, and then the rest of the time he could do whatever he wanted, including competing with Marvel. And so he and some not so reputable backers started a company called Stan Lee Media. I would say most of the people involved were probably reputable. There were one or two people who not so much.
Yeah, there was some fraud associated with that.
Well, yeah, that became a fiasco. Yeah.
Let me stop you so that people understand a little bit more about what you just said. So apparently Marvel had fallen into hard times. They go into Chapter 11 bankruptcy. In Chapter 11 bankruptcy, the goal is to save, some of the value of the company and keep it as an ongoing concern so it can recover. And theoretically, that's the best for creditors who will get paid more than if the company's simply disassembled, which is a Chapter 7. So for that plan to be viable, they need Stan Lee. And it couldn't have worked without Stan Lee. And so he makes this agreement for compensation, of course, that he will continue to give it time and attention, which preserves the value of the entity as long as people dealing with Marvel know his name's associated at least. And then, so meanwhile, though, he's no longer there working. He left in 98. So then I think it was 99, when he formed this company that you're about to describe. So he leaves and he needs to do something with himself. So he thought, look, I'm famous in my own name. Why don't I just start Stan Lee Media Incorporated?
I think people came to him with that idea. I mean, that he always admired people who gave the impression of being successful financially. Because I think he's still, when you ask, like, why didn't people sue more? Or I think people in comics, there's that lingering second-class feeling. I mean, that changed maybe with my generation and going forward. Maybe baby boomers in comics, and even there, I can't say it doesn't exist. But I think the idea that you were working in comic books, Stan tells a story. He'd go to a cocktail party, and you go to a fancy cocktail party when he was living in Long Island, and people would, oh, what do you do? And Stan would say, well, I'm in publishing, and try to walk away. Oh, what kind of publishing? Children's publishing. What kind of children's publishing? Well, action adventure story. Oh, what kind of action adventure story? Well, comic books. And then the other person would walk away.
There's probably some truth in that.
Maybe that was an encapsulation of a lot of different things. And he felt a loyalty to the company. He described himself as the ultimate company man. And again, it was a very comfortable situation. He could do whatever he wanted. So they started Stan Lee Media, and it was the beginning of the internet. So they got into characters, animation on the internet. And Stan had already been in Hollywood for close to 20 years at that point. He was living in the Hollywood Hills. He had sort of a classic Hollywood life. The thing about being Stan Lee, everybody would take a meeting with Stan Lee because he's Stan Lee. Most of those people would not go into business with him. They just wanted to meet him and get their comics autographed and brag to their friends they had a meeting with Stan Lee. So he spent years and years and years and years trying to sell Marvel properties that nobody wanted. Nobody took seriously. And then trying to sell his own property. So he lived well. He was well paid by Marvel. But then with the bankruptcy came this chance for him to do more. And I think it probably saved, I would imagine, the thinking at Marvel must have been, well, let's promise this guy 10% of something that'll never amount to anything rather than give him, X million dollars now. This way we keep his loyalty. We dangle his hope. The most successful movie Marvel had in 1998 was Blade, the first Blade movie. That was the first because Blade was a Marvel character. There had been no Marvel blockbusters in media up till then.
So, and at that point, I mean, to emphasize a feature of Stan that we've talked about a lot here today, but people need to understand how he can leave Marvel and as this celebrity go on to other opportunities, is that what you described in his nature, where anytime there's a platform, anytime there's a microphone, anytime there's an opportunity for his name to appear, he did that with Marvel. And he did that throughout the 60s, throughout the 70s, throughout the 80s. So, to the extent that any of these characters received any fame or credit, right or wrong, Stan Lee would be present or have his name associated with it.
And then the other thing is when Ditko and Kirby did leave. Ditko left fairly in 66, although he came back in the 70s. Basically, he left in 66. Kirby left in 1970. So once those guys left, Stan had no reason to not embellish the story and make, both personally and professionally and in terms of the company he worked for, it was to everybody in those camps' advantage for him to angle the story so that he was the creative genius behind it all. He always credited those guys as great artists, but I think especially once they left, he was not going to give them more than credit than that.
So there's a little bit, I don't think it's too much to say there's a little bit of a mythology associated with Stan Lee as single-handedly the person who produced all these famous characters. But
I think without him, the company wouldn't be. They would have just been a couple more. There just would have been another couple of dozen comic book characters that a handful of people remembered nostalgically. I think it was Stan's ability to convey what made Marvel special. That that is the thing that he did that that nobody else could.
And that goes back to I think the thing for which I'm hearing you say too that he's rightfully regarded as a great figure in modern business industry is that he foresaw what the comic business could become, and he's the one that positioned it, to get there by adding depth and meaningful characters and all these things that took place when he really took more control of the company in the early 60s. So that is fair to say, as you said.
Yeah, I would say that since we're looking at it again in hindsight, I think even at its height as a comic book company, Stan had lived through so many downturns in the business, having been in it since 1939 or 40, that I think even then, even at Marvel's early height, he was still constantly looking for ways to get out, if only to be working on a syndicated newspaper strip, which for some weird reason always got more respect. Among cartoonists and comic book writers, a newspaper strip was considered fairly high status and high earning. There was a period where people like Al Cap and Chester Gould were like rock stars. They were celebrities.
Oh, yeah.
I think that's what people in that business aspire to. Because again, we look at it 60 years later and go, oh, of course, Marvel. But when you're in the thick of it, you just go, well, maybe I can ride this for a couple of years, then I got to do something else.
So then let's talk about this transition where he's cut loose, or he has this agreement where he's helping Marvel through this bankruptcy, but really he knows he has to build his future elsewhere. He leaves, knowing what he knows, it seems natural for him to start or to be in a new business. But you said these other, they're like hedge fund guys and people who owned from Wall Street. They had serious money, apparently hundreds of millions of dollars, I think, to invest. And you said they came to him and proposed this?
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't remember all the details, but there were some of them who had less savory backgrounds. And I think they looked at him as a cash cow, some way to make a quick buck. I don't think these people had any vision of a future, or at least some of them. Again, I don't want to tar them all. I don't know them all. But I think there were certainly people there who just, let's make a lot of money now during the dot-com boom.
That's an important point for people to know, is that the time frame, what's going on here. Because at the time that you have Stan Lee looking for a new direction in his life, you have the dot-com crash. But it was a year away. Right. So here you have all this money pouring into all these .com. I assume all of our audience will remember, vast majority of you at least will remember, how you couldn't go wrong investing in a .com. Well, I'll say this to the credit of what little I know about this company that they formed, which was Stan Lee Media, was that they actually did create this incredible online platform that cost a lot of money and had this great interactivity with characters that apparently were newly created characters.
I had left Marvel by that point a couple of years earlier, and I was working for a bunch of .coms myself in the entertainment area. They brought me in to do Marvel-style
online
company called Byron Price Multimedia, company called Visionary Media. The problem was that in 1999, most people did not have high-speed internet. Yes, if you were one of the lucky few with high-speed internet, everything you say is right. They did come up with properties, whatever the quality was. You could watch these cartoons, and Stan was often narrating them or even a character in them.
And apparently it won awards for being innovative and whatnot. But go on with your point. I think I'm about to.
But 98% of the audience couldn't really appreciate it because we didn't have high-speed internet. We all had dial-up. So it was a lot of these companies, maybe because they were kind of created by people who were, the gearheads, and I say that in a, not
in the most flattering sense.
Technophiles who had this equipment at their disposal. Because I know that's what happened with the companies I worked for. We put out stuff that I think was pretty good. Just nobody could see it.
You were ahead of your time. If you were putting that out 10 years later when there was broadband.
And then there was the various questionable, I'm not a lawyer and I wasn't privy, but it did seem there was some shenanigans going on behind the scenes that Stan was not part of. One of the things about Stan that's a little maddening to those who worked with him is that he always gave himself plausible deniability. He admired people who were successful in business, but he always saw himself, or at least presented himself, as a creative guy. But he let the lawyers and accountants, and his wife, who was very protective of him, deal with the ugly actual handling and figuring out money. He didn't have a head for it, didn't have patience for it. I'm like a lot of creative people.
Yeah. And promoters.
Which led to him putting his faith over the years in people who maybe he shouldn't have.
Yeah.
Stanley Media crashed amid all sorts of scandals, and they'd hired like 200 people. They had a staff of some of the best artists and writers in the business. And then later, so out of the ashes of that, Stan and a couple of close associates formed something called POW Entertainment.
Okay, so wait now. So before we get to POW, this company that he formed, Stanley Media, Inc., as you point out, brings in lots of talent, lots of money. As a matter of fact, I think the president of Sony Digital, they hired away to head the company as president or something. Within a year, they're filing bankruptcy, I think, or 2. I mean, wasn't it? It's a real short period of time.
Yeah, year 2, something like that.
Yeah, it's very fast. So, but again, now I will say to the audience, remember the dot-coms crashed hard and fast, and there were some good ideas in there that didn't work for reasons such as what you've just described. At this point, it's to be expected that Stan would have to go looking elsewhere. Apparently, he had transferred some things. I think whatever claims he might have had to intellectual property, which is, as we've discussed, he really didn't have. But I think he purported to transfer to Stanley Media Enterprises.
This is the source of literally endless lawsuits, and this is the part I don't purport to be an expert in by any means. But certainly somewhere in the language of those contracts, Stan signed over any intellectual property he owned. I can't imagine he or his lawyers would have been dumb enough to ever say in writing that he owned the Marvel properties. I mean, that would be like law school, first year law student, like, don't say that. Right? So I now I'm just in the guessing area.
Well, let me throw in something though that you may not be able to shine any more light on, but it ties in with this incident or this contract you're describing. Apparently, there was a document in which Stan Lee signed away, and I thought it ended up with POW, the company we're going to talk about next. But he signed a document in which he gave up not only any intellectual property that he might own relating to, his years with Marvel, which, as we've talked at length, he did not own, but he signed away his own name, likeness, and image, and a signature. So he signed away these things, which he did. Obviously, he owned himself, and he owned his name, and he owned his likeness. He owned that. And that's the one thing that could have made him a living for the rest of his life. But apparently that ended up with POW, because I think a court ultimately, in like the 2000 teens, endorsed the agreement or ruled in favor of POW that they had the rightful ownership of this in perpetuity. That's just shocking to me. Do you know how that happened or any more about it than what I've just said? I know you're not a lawyer.
After Marvel, he had to go to Stanley Media. Well, no, he was already probably close to 80. He could have retired.
That's a good point. Yeah.
He claimed, and I think it was true. He He never wanted to retire. I don't know the ins and outs of his finances. I know that he seemed to generate a lot of money, but his family and he seemed to spend a lot of money. He did seem like even into his late 80s, even into his early, late 80s, early 90s, he was still on the go all the time.
And we should insert here for people who don't know, he lived to age 95 and he died in 2018. And his wife died in
2017.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And she was really his protector in many ways.
Yeah, she was 93, he was 95. So they were gifted with great longevity, both of them, for the year in which they were born given. But anyway, so here he is. He's 80 and very vibrant, we know, given his lifespan. So he wants to do other stuff, apparently.
Like a lot of creative people, or just people, he became so identified with his work and just liked to be busy. He liked being with creative people. He liked going to meetings. He enjoyed the action. He wasn't the guy who was going out to play golf. He wasn't going to play bridge. This was not, Stanley had no interest, in that stuff. He liked to make stuff and be
the center of attention.
He did a lot of convention appearances, and very often I would moderate. For a few years, I was like his regular moderator at this one chain of conventions.
Really?
And he would say, I'll be on panels, but I don't want to be with a bunch of other old people. I'm a active, functioning creator. Put me on with young people who are making new stuff. I don't want to be part of a nostalgia act. And he was very clear about that.
And he always was with younger people, wasn't he?
Usually. And the other thing about him that I noticed as a moderator and just knowing him and being writing his biography is he was a compulsive truth teller. There'd be like hype, and then he would say something, a profound truth or admission, surrounded by more hype. So you had to really listen. But go to any interview with Stan Lee on YouTube and really listen carefully, and you'll go, wow, I can't believe he said that in public. There'll always be something like that.
So maybe that's the reason that any misrepresentations early on were bound to get exposed. They'd get exposed by him.
His story of the history changed over time, which was not his most admirable trait. But if he was testifying against the Kirby heirs on behalf of Disney, the story would get slanted a certain way. He was in many ways the ultimate company man. I would say he was highly flawed, but did a lot of great things and a lot of generous things. But that did not always apply to the people that, with whom he created these things that he's best known for. It's, I just think he was very human,
Yeah. And so many ways in which to admire somebody. Everyone has their flaws. So let's move then to PAL. So I know that PAL survives today, this company, and I know that there was litigation later on a lot. Like, a matter of fact, before Stan died, there was a lawsuit filed literally I read this in 18, and it was later dismissed about a few months later. Before he died, I think dismissed. And his claim had been that they had wrongfully and fraudulently, induced him somehow to sign this document I just mentioned, where he signed over all of his likeness, image, etc., in perpetuity. But he dismissed that in 18. And later, after he had died that same year, his daughter filed suit alleging similar things, and she was so persistent that ultimately when the court finally dismissed for, must be the second or third time, a claim, the court sanctioned her $1 million. And I wondered, can that possibly be correct? Now, a sanction of $1 million would be generally for attorney fees, so it means that she must have caused them to incur a massive amount of fees, but maybe it wasn't all fees. But that I read this story. I don't remember the source, but it was reasonably reliable, an online journal. And I just thought, can that be correct? Do you have any comments on that?
Because of what I see as his carelessness about letting other people represent him and his willful naivete about business, especially after his wife died. And he was already, I don't know if he had dementia. I mean, I think he was pretty I think his mind was there till the end, but he was very weak physically.
And in fairness, can we not assume he surely was diminished somewhat? I mean,
Oh my God, yeah.
So he wasn't as sharp.
I think he was mentally pretty much there. Physically, terribly. I mean, he was just very, there were all sorts of lawsuits, all sorts of accusations, all sorts of accusals of elder care. At 1 week, there'd be one group of people in charge of his life. The next week, there'd be another group of people in charge of his life. They were constantly suing each other. They were still schlepping him to conventions. People would say to me, "Do you think there's elder abuse going on?" And at a certain point, I think there was, but say 2 or 3 years, you'd see Stan at a convention, clearly tired, but then he'd come on stage and be totally energized, and loving the attention. And what I would say to people was, knowing what you know of Stan Lee, do you think he'd rather die at home in bed with the covers over his head, or on stage in front of 10,000 adoring fans? At a certain point, I think he should not have been he was a cash cow for a lot of people. There's another book, another biography of Stan by a guy named Abraham Reisman. That's a more negative view. I think I think my book is a little more balanced, but the Reisman book, goes to places that I chose not to go. So if you want to know about some of the down and dirty stuff going on in Stan Lee's last couple of years, that book certainly has a lot of that. But I mean, in terms of, say, the topic of this show and of your podcast, it's a Stan Lee's life is a great lesson in making sure you have the T's crossed and the I's dotted about your estate and your affairs, because this is kind of a typical Hollywood story in a way. You hear this a lot about celebrities, and just people come in and take advantage of them, and they may even be helping them in certain ways. That
which is usually the case.
Every vulture has a rationalization and stuff you can look and go, "Oh, that's a good thing they did for Stan."
You're absolutely right.
And that's how they rationalize it, I guess.
Yeah.
But he really, like I said, especially once his wife was dead, she had been a very vigorous defender of his and their interests. He just became, both a cash cow, and I think people just liked somehow having control over his life. It was very sad. It was very, if you look up the newspaper reports in those days.
So let me fill in some gaps here. With PAL, with the organization, that this new company which succeeded Stan Lee Media Inc., that entity survived, and he continued to have a role for some period of time. I know that the lawsuit that I guess was against whoever ended up owning Marvel in these changes of hands after the Chapter 11, but the lawsuit that was settled, it was filed in 2002, it was settled in 2004, in which Stan Lee claimed that he was owed this 10% of the profits that Marvel received relating to his characters that hadn't been paid. So the $10 million that you mentioned was paid. And also, I think, as part of that agreement, and it was settled. It wasn't just a court decree that said $10 million. The court ruled in favor of Stan, and there would need to be a determination as to how much was actually owed. But there ended up being, in the following months, a settlement among the parties. And so the agreement was that the $10 million or so, but also that there would be a payment of $1 million a year for him to continue to be this promoter, this goodwill ambassador on the brands, et cetera. It's my impression that the $1 million a year, that he continued to receive that up until close to or at his death. Do you know whether that's...
I don't have any reason to think he didn't.
Yeah. Because he continued to be a promoter.
He had a very friendly relationship, and he was in, the cameos up until the very end. I don't know what on behind closed doors, but Stan used to refer to his lawsuit with Marvel as the friendliest lawsuit on record. When you look at a company like Marvel that by then was owned by Disney, $10 million is walking around money for them. I mean, it's...
Yeah. And to get this guy for $1 million a year to continue to be ambassador for you, I can see how that was an easy decision.
And not only to be ambassador, but to, on the other side of the coin, to not be a negative ambassador, to not say anything bad.
Which he would be capable of doing, I'm sure.
I think a part of him still felt almost, I mean, he was a realist, but I think there was some part of him that almost felt it was still his cousin's company. And he had a plenty complicated relationship with with Martin Goodman.
But it is correct, is it not, that Marvel, those characters were acquired out of bankruptcy into another entity, and that entity was not POW, was it? Marvel
was merged with a company called Toy Biz.
There we go. Okay, that's what I'm missing.
It was a company owned by Ike Perlmutter and Avi Arad.
Okay.
They had a license to make Marvel toys, and their existence depended. There's a book called Comic Wars by Dan Raviv that's a pretty accurate accounting of these, as far as I can tell. Their survival as an entity depended on them actually beating out Ronald Perlman. There was like a New York Times Sunday business section that had Perlman and Carl Icahn duking it out.
Really?
There was a superhero battle. But for Toy Biz to survive, they needed to basically kind of swoop in. I don't know. And again, this book details how they did it. Grab Marvel away from both Icahn and Perlman. And so really Marvel Comics then merged with Toy Biz, and Toy Biz changed its name to Marvel.
Okay. All right.
So in a sense, it's really Toy Biz, but of course it's Marvel, And
I understand now.
All the properties and everything else.
It's POW that Disney wanted to continue to have access to Stan Lee's brand, and he was, intending to produce some things through POW. Disney bought, I think, initially a 9% stake, and then they expanded that stake some. But the intellectual property, those characters are safely in the hands of a large organization like Disney. And
every few years, some version of the ghost of Stan Lee Media rises and initiates a lawsuit, and then the lawsuit is settled somehow, I assume. Some money changes.
There was so much litigation, and what I'm going to do is we're going to wrap up this episode, which I apologize so much for our time constraints.
You can see it's so hard to get me to talk.
Well, you're very interesting, and Stan Lee is very interesting. I mean, he's eventful as a character, as a person, And so, and what helps is that you were an insider in a way, at least the industry, as well as the company. So, so you bring a special perspective.
That was my promotional angle on the book, on A Marvelous Life, The Amazing Story of Stan Lee. That was, I thought, what I brought to the table that even the best journalist or professional biographer couldn't. I like to think I'm now a professional biographer now that I've written 2 biographies. But
I think that qualifies.
Yeah. But I mean, I think I brought something to the table with the Stan Lee story in particular that nobody else really could.
Definitely. No question. So thank you for being on. I very much enjoyed it. I know our audience did. I hope you've enjoyed this, the second episode of Stan Lee's life. So the next episode will be where we'll focus strictly on the estate planning issues, decisions relating to estate planning, even those toward the end of Stan's life, as well as things that happened thereafter. So that's the real opportunity to focus on the legal aspects of our subject. Anyway, many of you I know are primarily interested in that, so I certainly don't want you to miss the next episode coming up, which will be third and final episode on Stan Lee. And others perhaps will not be interested in the legal segment, so you may not tune in. But anyway, I hope you all do look forward to the third episode. I think you'll find it wonderful. There's so much to be said about Stan's life. Unfortunately, there are a lot of bad decisions, even though he's a great man in many ways. There were some decisions that were not good, and it's such a learning opportunity for you to hear about the way things can be better. And some of those things doubtlessly will apply to you individually and to your families. So that's really the primary purpose of this show, is to educate as well as entertain. Anyway, that will be in the third episode on the life and legacy and estate planning of Stan Lee. Till next time, this is Joe Cordell. This is Life's Third Act. Take care.
You've been listening to Life's Third Act, a podcast for thriving in retirement. Sponsored by Tucker Allen, your estate and elder law advisors. Each week, we discuss topics and answer questions to help you better plan for your future. For more information, visit tuckerallen.com. Subscribe and listen again next week for another edition of Life's Third Act. The choice of a lawyer is an important decision and should not be based solely on advertisements.